And welcome to this week's Practice as Research seminar from the Practice as Research Network. As I'm really excited. I mean, this is the last one that we have in this academic year, but it's been such a good academic year on all things ethics already. And it's therefore really, really exciting to finish off with a particularly difficult topic. And that's about researching violence with young people, talk about sensitive topics and vulnerable participants. It's all coming to a head here in today's session. And we have got with us Professor Jenny Parks, who is going to be talking about that. So Professor Parks is a professor in education, gender and international development in the Center for Education and International Development at the Institute of Education, UCL's Faculty of Education and Society. Her work on young people and violence has involved multiple collaborations, including most recently the COVAC, which is the Context of Violence in Adolescents cohort study, a research partnership with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and the violence prevention NGO, Raising Voices, which is located in Uganda. So, as always, we are going to have the presentation and the talk by Professor Parks, as in by our guest first, and then we will open up to any kind of questions. If you do have any questions, please feel free to use the chat box throughout. I will keep an eye on them and I can raise those questions on your behalf, or otherwise feel free to unmute yourself later when we open up for the discussion, and you can join in the discussion at that stage yourself. So with no further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to hand over to Professor Parks.
Great, thank you, Nicole. So now I need to share my screen.
Yes, it's coming up. Thank you. We can see that now.
Great, thanks. Very honoured to be invited. This invitation came about a year ago when the IOE, Phil at the IOE Ethics Committee at that time, we'd been in various discussions about some of the thorny ethical challenges that many of us work with, and he asked me to come and join a seminar. So it's kind of taken a while to come off the ground, and I'm very delighted to be here. So thanks, Nicole, for getting this going. Now, why isn't my slide moving on? Do it that way. Just to introduce the seminar, research on violence is absolutely kind of replete with ethical and methodological challenges. We know that violence is surrounded with silences, issues of power, inequality, all sorts of kind of taboos around speaking about violence. And so it's a very kind of complex and difficult area for research. And then that's, particularly when it involves children and young people. And I think many of the challenges are, in a sense, the challenges that are there in all research with young people. But perhaps it gets amplified when it's around these kind of sensitive topics, such as violence. There is quite a bit of guidance now. In my last slides, I've got some of that, some references. But in terms of things that have influenced the work that I've been doing over the years, some really good guidance and tools around violence against children, violence against women, school-related gender-based violence, and UNICEF, World Health Organization, have developed quite interesting and helpful practical tools. And then there's a huge amount, obviously, of academic literature that links with research ethics, and the particular strands of that have influenced my work over the years are the kind of feminist literature, work from childhood studies, and perhaps more recently, I mean, it's been there all the time, but it's been increasingly central in my own thinking, has been decolonial writing and some of the challenges coming from that in terms of research ethics. And I also wanted to acknowledge, apart from this kind of range of literature, the key ways in which I've been learning about these things from research partners, colleagues, and so processes, just doing the research, and also the doctoral students that I've worked with over the years, and students on the MA Education, Gender, International Development, who've all kind of brought so many interesting and illuminating thoughts and questions around these issues over the past 20 years for me. And so what I want to aim to do today is to share and discuss some of the ethical challenges we've encountered and how we've tried to address these. I've been very uncomfortable. I emailed Nicole yesterday to say, oh, you know, these Zoom spaces are difficult. And what about, do we really need to record it? She said, no, it's going to be fine to be recorded. So there's a, you know, we're kind of going to be talking about safe spaces in research, but it doesn't always feel very safe when you're on Zoom. You know that you don't know who's there or who's going to be in the future. But I'm very much looking forward to the discussion part of this session and hearing your thoughts and ideas and experiences as well. These are some of the projects I've worked on over the years, and the reason I put them up here is because I wanted to say a little bit about the kind of different kinds of work. A lot of my research has been loosely around young people and violence in different forms. But some of that work, and particularly the early work I did, was more directly with young people myself. I worked in the UK, I worked in projects in South Africa around things to do with risk and safety and living with violence in the neighbourhood, different forms of violence in the neighbourhood. And that was qualitative research. And then more recently, I've worked on projects where the central to those projects is partnerships. I'm one part of a partnership of organisations working across different spaces. And so the SPAGS project and the Warner Stop Violence Against Girls in Schools was an ActionAid project over 5 years, where it was linked to their intervention in Kenya, Ghana and Mozambique. And we were one of the research partners working with research partners and activist partners in 3 different country settings. So very, very different kind of project than the ones that I'd been doing before that. And gender violence in schools was another different kind of project. That was a UNICEF-led initiative, which was working more at the level of governments, really, working with education ministries and then with stakeholders at different kind of levels of policy enactment around school-related gender-based violence. And it did have some work with directly with young people. Obviously, it was hugely concerned with young people, but a lot of that work was with kind of policy actors in that particular project. On the right-hand side here, I've got a sort of sub-study that we did from the bigger project, COVAC, which I'm going to say a little bit more about in a minute. And this was a particular study that we did during the COVID lockdown in Uganda, looking at young people, inequalities and violence as part of a bigger project. But the reason I've included that here is because that, again, there was in that project, that particular work was a qualitative piece of research, but we were collecting data through mobile phones with young people who were part of an ongoing project. So there's that kind of issues around remote data collection. So these projects all have different kinds of methodologies, different kinds of partnerships, different kinds of locations. And there's sort of common issues that we have, but also some distinct issues, I think, in terms of how these different kinds of projects think about or engage with questions around ethics. Most of my work is multi-partner projects that are located in the Global South. And my own positioning is, always in all these projects, in a sense, I'm an outsider. Right from the beginning, I'm an adult, working with children who had professional experience working with children before I moved into the academic one, but obviously I'm not a child. I'm now, increasingly in sense an outsider where I'm an adult white foreign professor in a UK university, bringing all those sorts of issues to do with power and hierarchy that are part of that kind of global knowledge system that we're all part of. In a sense, I think what I have tried to do in all these projects is what is it find called working the hyphen. So sort of trying to, you can never get rid of those power inequalities and sort of self-other distinction, but just to try and unsettle them a bit through the kind of methodologies that we use, but also through the kind of partnerships, and hopefully that will come out in some of the things that I'm going to be talking about. And in all these projects, we've had a kind of conceptualization of violence, which I would call as multidimensional, where we're not just concerned with acts of violence, but also with violence as being negotiated experience through everyday life and everyday interactions, and within these kind of broader structural inequalities, hierarchies, and so on. And that gender has been a core theme in my work, and other intersecting inequalities as well. Oh, and I just want to say, I'm about to go on to another slide, but on the right-hand side, you can see some names, and these are some of the particular people I wanted to mention today, because quite a bit of the stuff I'm going to be talking about today is to do with COVAC. And Simona, who's here, Simona Datsberger's colleague in SEED, the Centre for Education and International Development, who's works with us on this project. Joanne Kasidi, Rehema Nagawa, and Brian Musenze are researchers on the project based in Uganda themselves. At the and then I also want to kind of mention Amia Bhatia and Karen De Vries, who are at the London School of Hygiene, who are also partners in this project. There are other partners as well in all these projects who I should mention, but it would take us too long. So I'm going to just say a little bit about COVAC, because that's what we're working on recently. This is a cohort study. It's a mixed method study. It's longitudinal. It's been running from 2017 to 2023, although actually some more quantitative data comes from earlier project. It's located in Luwero district in Uganda, and it aims to broadly to build understandings of how family, peers, school and community contexts affect young people's experiences of violence in adolescence and early adulthood. Luwero is a neighbourhood where the main employment is subsistence farming, but there are also various other informal and more formal kind of forms of labour. It's a kind of mixture of rural, peri-urban towns, and some of the young people also live in Kampala, in the capital, as a smaller number of them have moved from Luwero. So there's a certain amount of movement between Luwero and other areas. The project has involved quite large surveys in 2014, 2018 and 2022. Each round of survey, I've just put the figures in for the 2018, but it's nearly 3,000 young people in each round, and then they participated in same young people in 3 rounds of surveys. And then it's included qualitative data collection, which Simona and I work on for 2 to 3 months each year, with 36 young people, so much smaller group of young people who we've been working with now, with Joanne, Rehema and Brian, kind of meeting them every year, but also having some contact by phone in between. They were roughly 15 to 17 at the beginning of the project. So some of them, many of them are about 20 now. And we've also worked with teachers, caregivers, their peers, other stakeholders. So it's got, and the surveys are led by the London School of Hygiene team, but we work very closely in terms of mixing the methods of design, the analysis. Anyway, that's the organisations below. I won't go through them, but they're the ones who are partners in this project. So I wanted to pull out some particular areas that have been challenges for us in this project and other projects over the years. And I guess the first challenge is whether research is how it can be a safe space for young people. And we know that talking about violence isn't safe. It evokes all sorts of memories of fear, anger, confusion, shame. There is potential for repercussions as well. There might be physical dangers for young people who speak out. And we know from there's some research on intimate partner violence how difficult that can be if a partner hears that their partner is speaking to a researcher, then they can become very suspicious and so on. And that can be a risk for the young person. I mean, as in all research, it's really important to have informed consent, but I am highly aware that it's not very easy for a child to refuse consent when they're working with an adult. Some of the research has been in schools, and we tend not to say no if a teacher suggests something or if an adult suggests something. And there's obviously a whole literature around what does consent mean. There's whether parental consent, well, is it can be a way to protect young people and advocate for young people in relation to consent, but also people like Alderson and Morrow have argued that children should have the right to consent independently of their parents. And I think some people working in research around domestic violence have taken that on board. That's discussed in the article by Morris that I included there. In terms of a big issue for us and our research has been around privacy and confidentiality. You know, that young people a lot of our research has been in communities where there are busy households and people get interrupted. It's very hard to find a kind of quiet space to speak. And then those issues can be amplified when you're trying to adopt phone interviews, as happened during COVID, both in the qualitative part of the research and also in the survey that was being conducted by phone because of not being able to be there face to face. And we adopted slightly different approaches. The quantitative team did things like included code words, and that's been used quite a bit in IPV research, where you agree a word that if somebody comes into the room while you're speaking, you say that word and the researcher knows to stop or to change the subject or so on. In the qualitative team, it was in a sense slightly easier because the researchers knew the young people already quite well by the time there was a lockdown and they were speaking on the phone. And so they could be kind of attuned and needed to be attuned to changes in tone. And there were a few times where they kind of realised that someone wasn't alone anymore and kind of responded accordingly. On the right-hand side, I've included the footprint, is another strategy that the project we adopted, because actually it came mainly from our activist partners who weren't very happy with the name of the project. And it also comes out of, again, from other research. I think it comes particularly from violence against women research, where if you include the word violence in the title of the research, that in itself can be a risk for participants, because somebody else might see the consent form, they might hear the name of the project, they might have heard of it in the neighbourhood. And so it doesn't really give the privacy to someone who chooses to participate in that project. On the other hand, I think you have to be really careful not to be misleading people. So that in terms of the kind of information that you give to participants, has to be clear about what this project is actually about. So that can be a tricky distinction. You also need to have a kind of protocol for how do you deal with young people who become distressed or appear distressed. And that can be difficult to recognise. That this study on young people who've experienced domestic violence that cited here discusses how in the UK young people often don't look distressed, but they might just sort of look away or seem distracted or just kind of take their attention somewhere else. So kind of working with the research teams on what might be the signs that someone isn't wanting to speak about this or is getting unhappy about this, that needs to be thought about before the research goes ahead. And then in terms of the quantitative and qualitative research, I would argue have quite a different way of dealing with how to encourage young people to speak about violence. So the quantitative studies try to have very clear and unambiguous questions. I mean, in a sense, so do qualitative studies, but this is kind of very central, I think, to the survey design. Partly because things like, you know, particularly talk about sex, but also talk about sexual violence, and we tend to talk in euphemisms. And so they're trying to work out what the right language to use for a particular age or a particular location is really important and quite difficult in this area. So our quantitative team also spent a lot of time piloting it, working with young people to check on the language before finalising the language of the surveys. And then there is a number of studies that have shown that computer-assisted surveys where the human factor is kind of removed from it. There's no direct contact with a human. Seem to increase the disclosure rates. So there's a sense in which the quantitative approach is to try and sort of remove the personal in a way, that kind of personal interaction, whereas the qualitative research tends to do almost the opposite. It relies on the research relationship to create an environment where it's possible to talk about these difficult and sensitive issues. And it does that partly through ethnographic and participatory methods that are trying to enable, trying to engage young people to be kind of interesting young people, and to what we've also done in COBAC was we only interviewed other people who the core participants, these 36 core participants, wanted us to interview. So we always had their suggestions or their permission before we spoke to caregivers or teachers, or we asked them which teacher they'd like to speak to, they'd like us to speak to. So that kind of thing, trying to give a little bit more control over with young people over the methods and the research design. And obviously there are lots of different ways of doing this. So the kinds of things that we've used in some of our projects are River of Life interviews. Like there's a picture on where we ask, the researcher asks the young person to sort of think of their life as a river, and then to add kind of difficult or easy moments, or pleasurable or painful moments in their lives, as a way of stimulating discussion. And then, because it's a longitudinal study, they can bring back that river next year and ask them to look at it again, ask them to add on to it, ask them, to reflect on it. So it's a very for lots of young people, they enjoy using that technique. Some say, oh no, I don't want anything to do with drawing. And then you you negotiate the kinds of approaches that we've used. That's worked very well for developing these kind of biographical narratives around young people's lives. And things like community walks, where you're talking about the community around, talking about the journey to school, that kind of thing. Working with groups around mapping environment dangers, danger or safety zones. These are kind of different kinds of ways in which we've gathered data. Quite a bit of the work, so my early work, I did quite a lot of work on developing research groups where young people worked with their friends in a research group, which was mostly great, but it can go wrong. And I think it's part of the issue, I think, has been that if you're working with everyday violence in young people's lives, it is possible that everyday violence will end up being reenacted within the research space. Just to give a couple of examples, I had one project where we were working on, we're talking about, so quite a bit of the work was about gangs in the neighbourhood. And I realised that one of the research groups, some of the pseudonyms that young people were choosing were kind of gang names. And then there was some kind of kudos and pride in articulating some of the kind of language and practices around gang activity. And I was kind of uncomfortable about whether I was reinforcing the particular dynamics that group were reinforcing some of the dynamics of power that were operating around young people in gangs in the neighbourhood. And then another example, which was a bit different, but this was work from a long time back in South Africa, quite soon after 9/11, where the friendship group involved Christian and Muslim young people, and there was some of the discriminatory remarks about that were associating Islam with violence were floating around in the communities, started to be kind of whispered in the research space between by some of the Christian girls. And in a sense, the research space there was just kind of echoing what was happening more widely. But as a researcher, I think sometimes we think that friendship groups are going to be always safe and make things safer, but actually it doesn't necessarily happen. So how you plan for that, and I'm interested to hear what other people have experienced in this kind of work. How do you plan for that? How do you deal with that? How do you support young people in testing each other if they experience some sort of discrimination or, in a sense, violence within the research setting. The other thing, and that we do in the quality research, which in a sense is different from some of the surveys where you're having some very direct questions and you think carefully about where in the survey you put the most difficult questions and so on. You think about it, you're still in there. In the qualitative work, we have tended not to ask direct questions about experiences of violence. So there might be questions about violence, but they are not about directly asking young people about their own experiences. So it leaves young people with the choice of whether they want to raise violence and only do so if they feel comfortable. So there are sort of different ways in which different methods handle how you discuss violence. I can't see that. What does it say? Does it say we're at half?
10 minutes, 10 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to speed up a bit. This is just one quote that I was thinking it came out very recently in some of the work, our ongoing work. This is Juliet, who's a Ugandan 17-year-old girl. She said she's known Joanne, the researcher, for several years, and Joanne's asking her about who she goes to for support. And she says, I don't share my problems with anyone. I can only share with you. And Joanne says, well, why don't you want to share? And Juliet says, once I speak my problems to anyone, it feels as though I've told the whole world about it. I develop shame. And the first part of that kind of gave me pause for thought. On the one hand, it shows, how fantastic Joanne is as a researcher, that she can kind of develop these very close, trusting relationships with young people over time. But, there's a kind of potential for blurring the role of researcher with counsellor or friend. And then, Joanne's going to stop working with her after a while, and how you end research, particularly with these longitudinal studies, is that kind of going to reinforce feelings of loss or rejection that young people may already have experienced? I think when I thought about that particular quote and read the rest of that particular interview, I realised that actually Juliet does share her problems with other people. She talked about all sorts of other people that she shares her problems with. And I think actually what's going on there is she's saying that there's something very distinctive about the research relationship that makes it a different kind of sharing of problems. And, maybe that is something to do with the kind of close, just being listened to in a very kind of close way, so and without being criticised, which I think cuts across all sorts of research with many people, but is an interesting theme. But it is really important, obviously, to be very clear about what that relationship is and not to kind of present it as a relationship between friends. Okay, I want to just move on to child protection and safeguarding. Of course, there's a very high likelihood of disclosures of abuse in research with young people on violence. Because of the topic, because young people may feel that they're being kind of heard for the first time, and they're trusting research with unsafe information. And so it's really important that the researchers are prepared for that, and that there's what we've developed in CODAC is a very clear and careful disclosure protocol that has kind of step-by-step instructions for the kinds of how to respond to different forms of disclosure and who should respond and how to respond. Obviously, there are, across research with young people, there are legal and statutory duties around breaking confidence as a risk of harm to young people or to others. And it's really important in any research like this to be working with local child protection services, sometimes phone lines or online websites. Researchers have DBS clearance if you're in the UK, but that doesn't, none of those things work if you're working in a context where child protection services are weak. as in many of the contexts we've been working. And so it's absolutely critical, I think, to be working with partner organisations. So one of our research partners is Raising Voices in Uganda, who work on violence prevention specifically. And to think about how to respond if there are disclosures, and then also the kind of preventive and systemic work that Raising Voices might want to be doing. We've also employed counsellors in our research and had counsellors and counselling organisations. So, and any of the young people can ask to see a counsellor. That's kind of offered at any occasion. So there are obviously some cost implications for research studies on these themes to really make sure that we have kind of systems and strategies in place. And then I wanted to touch on safety of researchers as well. There might be, and we've experienced a number of difficulties in different projects that I've been involved with over the years, that then the researchers themselves might experience physical dangers working in high violence neighbourhoods or in homes where there's tensions and conflict. There's the emotional load that researchers are taking in terms of talking about these issues with young people and what they carry away with what the researchers, what that might trigger in emotionally for researchers themselves. There are all sorts of practical safety procedures that need to be planned for, risk assessments around the locations, the kind of how making sure that there are transport arrangements that keep researchers safe, keeping in touch with political events, sometimes avoiding data collection during election periods. Sometimes that we've experienced things where that's sort of been unavoidable. Something's a kind of event has happened where violence has broken out that wasn't predicted. Obviously, we kind of look at FCDO advice, from Commonwealth and Development Office advice, but sometimes these things kind of erupt. So also thinking about what could happen and how to respond in emergency situations is very, very important. And some of the things that our teams have done is thought about situations where they will make sure they're traveling in pairs or groups, and the team leader needing to be aware of researchers' movements and locations, having emergency 24-hour contacts, and then also working with researchers on what do you do if there's hostility or aggression that you're confronted with. We've had daily debriefs within research and found that very important for our researchers. And then there are also issues to do with kind of potential for power dynamics within a research team, where, for example, I mean, it can be very intense and be on field work, and sometimes there can be misunderstandings, or there can be power inequalities. There can be forms of sexual harassment that may be echoing sexual harassment that might be happening in the neighbourhood anyway, but they can start to play out within research teams. And I don't think we always plan or expect that, because we kind of think of research as always having integrity, but it's really important that that's sort of thought about in terms of kind of researcher training and the work right from early on, and having codes of conduct that are work developed within the research team in the inception periods of research. And then thinking about who benefits from the research, we know, violence is in itself sort of silencing, that it's often shrouded in kind of secrecy. And one of the main aims of research on this area is to expose what is hidden, and more broadly to understand some of the power dynamics surrounding violence and how those are contested. Ultimately, the aim is often to reduce violence or to influence interventions to reduce violence. But the research is pretty unlikely to have direct benefits to the participants themselves with that regard. And it's important not to be misleading about what promises, what the research is there for, what promises that can be made. Again, I'm sure this is completely familiar to lots of you. There's also potential harm at all kind of phases of research of reinforcing deficit discourses about, for example, girls in the global south as victims, or as heroines, that you can target the girls themselves and they can survive and contest the violence themselves, which is highly problematic in many ways. And at the same time as reinforcing deficit discourses around men as violent, or sort of culture or family as being harmful. And these come across again and again in research. And how do we make sure that violence research isn't doing that? And there's writing, and a number of my colleagues and discussions with colleagues have been thinking about whether the research should be about reversing the gaze, around critically interrogating the aid politics, the colonial histories, the neo-colonial experiences that are reproducing and maybe at the heart of some of this kind of interpersonal violence, and also thinking about the kind of structural complicity of us, the UCL researchers in the knowledge hierarchies, the way we gain from the publications, the kind of epistemic violence of that can happen. And so some of the work of these Leila Cadwell and other colleagues have thought very deeply about these issues, and I think we all kind of need to reflect on these within our work. I guess one of our ways of trying to deal with some of those issues is through developing sort of critical dialogues, where the research, throughout the research from the planning to publications, we create spaces for discussing, dialogue, arguing about the research within research teams, and with young people, with activists, teachers, governments, and different ways in which those might happen. And we've thought about that in relation to sort of recognizing it's not just about having discussion, it's about also reflecting on our own limitations and the sort of limitations of our tools, our different approaches, and thinking also about what we produce from the research and who it's for and what methods to use. Last slide. Just to wrap up, I think the ways of handling ethical issues on violence from young people, then these are some issues, I think, broad challenges that come across all research, but the different kind of research traditions and methodologies sometimes use different approaches. They don't need to use different approaches, but there's not a one-size-fits-all toolkit, I don't think, for this kind of research. Some of the key things to think about are really the importance of researcher qualities and the kind of training and the ongoing support for researchers themselves are key to minimising harm. Research doesn't eradicate risks, in my view, but we do need to kind of recognise the possible risks and plan how to reduce them, and that may have cost implications. So thinking about that when planning and applying for research. Thinking about the kind of research pathways and protocols is crucial in all research, and particularly in the context of limited child protection system. And absolutely key is kind of having strong partnerships with people who have expertise around practical expertise around working with violence. And then my last point really is to thinking about publications. This was a recent paper that was looking at how, I think they were looking at violence against children and violence against women publications during COVID, I think. But what they looked at was how ethics processes were discussed in the publications. This was academic publications. And they found that although people talked about whether they had ethical clearance, they talked a bit about things like informed consent. They didn't talk at all about most of the issues that I've been talking about now. So in terms of what you do, the kind of referrals, systems, anything. And so it's really important, I think, that we need, and I'm guilty of this as well. After I read the article, I kind of went back to some of my papers like, oh dear, you haven't said enough about how you thought about these things. So we really need to sort of think about documenting how we address these complex challenges of research, researching violence with young people, and hold ourselves to account. That is the rest of my slides. I've got some.
Thank you very much, Jenny.
Yes.
Thank you very much. You get a round of applause from me. I know that everybody else, and there were quite a few comments to me directly, but also some to the general room, saying thank you for the really interesting and thought-provoking talk that you have given us. On your last point, you were saying about ethics processes. Dr. Sarah Young and myself have literally just launched a call for contributions to an edited book, which is called Ethics in Practice as Research, Interdisciplinary Perspectives. I have put the link into the chat box if anybody is interested to have a look at it. This is exactly what this book is trying to do, is trying to cover that gap of how do people actually navigate ethics in practice as research. There are a couple of questions in the chat box which I would like to raise on behalf of contributors. So there was one question: when working with partner organizations, did you and your research team encounter any gatekeeping? And if there was any gatekeeping, what steps did you take to navigate them?
I guess, do you mean gatekeeping in terms of controlling who you speak to, that kind of thing? Yes,
so that's, I think it's about sometimes, especially early careers researchers or doctoral or early postdoctoral researchers may be told that they can't do particular kinds of research. So, either by the organizations that, you're working with, or by supervisors, etc. So how do you navigate, how can you navigate those spaces when it's clearly a sensitive topic and a vulnerable participant?
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly had that with, I remember one of my early projects was I did manage to get into working in this school that I was working with young people, but the head teacher decided he was very suspicious about what I was doing. So he would just walk into the research space at kind of any moment. And so there was a sense in which he was, and everything would stop. So you'd have this lovely flow of activities and everyone was having a really nice time. Then in he'd come along, or a loudspeaker would suddenly interrupt the session. So there's that kind of gatekeeping that can happen. There have been, in terms of organisations, there probably are ways in which who we speak to has been controlled, but often that can be negotiated. I think there's a kind of reverse thing that I think happens quite a bit, which is that we kind of work on, we expect, like with Raising Voices, they work in the communities, and sometimes we discuss research findings with them, and expect them to then work with the schools or work with the district health authorities. And that can be the hardest part of the work. So some of our research recently around teachers and sexual violence, the Raising Voices wants to take that work forward, but that, in a sense, I thought my research, or our research, was very difficult, but actually I realised that's the easy bit of it, and the hard bit is then how they then engage discussions with people. So it's not quite gatekeeping, but it's about that relationship with organisation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So there's another question. You were talking earlier about questions that are not directly about violence, but might create space for participants to share. So could you share a little bit more about that, and you know, some kind of examples, and also could you share a little bit more about how you hold your daily debriefs?
Yeah, I think I'm going to also bring in Simona here, because Simona's, I'd like to give Simona an opportunity to speak. So Simona, if you want to come in on these questions, please send your, put your camera on, and yeah, thank you. I'll start us off and then hand over to Simona. In terms of the direct questions, it might be that with the River of Life, for example, if we talk about, well, can you tell us, you know, some of the good and bad things that have happened this year, it can sort of naturally flow. We don't, when they start talking about bad things, we don't say, has this happened to you? But it comes out of the discussion, or why did you draw that stone? You know, there's those kind of things. Or it can be that we ask, one of the things we did recently was feedback on some of the findings from our research. So some young people have said this happens. So some young people have said that teachers, that male teachers have made sexual advances to them. You know, have you ever heard about that in your school? So you're not asking them then to speak about their own personal experience of that, but you're asking about them they can choose to speak about their experience of that. So that's the kind of way that we have. Those are just a couple of examples. Simona, do you want to come in on either of the things around violence, but also around the daily, or maybe speak about the daily debriefs?
Yeah, just a few words about the daily debriefs. So this really depended on whether we were also present in the field in Uganda, or whether we sort of like collected the data remotely, which happened during COVID. While in Uganda, we would meet at the end of the day, and then researchers would just sort of like talk about the interview, and not just about the information that was shared, but about the whole environment in which the interview took place. Sort of like also observing, okay, was the problem perhaps a caregiver who would walk in or who would want to intervene? Was there a safe space in the school where researchers would meet the participants and so forth? And then we would reflect and sort of like discuss issues, positive as well as maybe some challenging experiences as a team. During COVID, we would then reduce those meetings to weekly calls, in which we would meet the researchers online, and then sort of like the same weekly type of meeting would happen, but in a way as a wrap up of a couple of interviews that I've done.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much, both of you. I've got two more questions that I really want to put in. So I may be slightly overrunning my hour today, but I think it's quite important to bring those questions in. There's one, Jenny, I would like to know a little bit more about how you practically work the hyphen in your research.
Yeah, do you want to give the other question as well, and then I'll come back? Yeah.
The other questions are more about, sort of valuing contributions to research. So how do we navigate naming and not naming people? Because obviously they've got a right to be named as participants, and also whether or not we are paying for incentives for people to take part in research.
Yeah. Okay, some really good questions. in terms of practically working the hyphen, I think, I mean, from the earlier work that I did where I'm working directly with young people, and I was a foreigner. The first research that I did was in South Africa, so I was a foreigner, white foreigner, and I guess I tried to introduce myself as someone who, you know, didn't know, so someone who kind of was trying to learn from young people, but also the kind of methods, kinds of approach and the kind of negotiation. But again, I think what's really been important is actually being able to do this research over a period. Most of my researchers have been very, very lucky because it hasn't been one-off things. It's been over time. So you can build up relationships that are not massively disrupting, but disrupting to an extent some of the kind of hierarchies of adult-child relationships. But the other area that more recently I think has really been, and I haven't really had time to talk about it, but the kind of work around thinking about what do we mean by these kind of critical dialogues with partners? How do we make sure that we're valuing different kinds of knowledge, and that people, you know, whose names are included on publications, all those kinds of things that that are ongoing projects that try to acknowledge these sort of difficult hierarchies that there are, and unsettle them just a bit. It doesn't, I don't think they're ever equal relationships. So it's just kind of trying to nudge at them. I think it's very important. Then in the other questions where you were looking at valuing contribution to research, there are all sorts of things here. I know we haven't got time to talk about them really. I recognise the point about naming or not naming. Actually, in all my research, we have used, we haven't really had the option of naming yourself, partly because it's, I think, such a difficult topping area, so that we would always use pseudonyms. Sometimes we would disguise organisations as well, but certainly around. But there might be that we can, there might be related activities like, you know, young people making films, but then you have to be really careful not to be making those in a way that you're then identifying the young people. They can be identified that way. So then you might also be bringing some who are research participants, some who are not research participants. You're not necessarily distinguishing. And then in terms of paying paying is a really tricky one. So we've used different things in different projects. In COVAC, we did thanked people through things like soaps, pens, and so on. And then when during the lockdown, there was a terrible financial situation that people were living in, and the researchers thought it was kind of unethical to be not providing any kind of material support, and we ended up using kind of where you give mobile phone money, which is kind of ostensibly to help the contacts, but actually sometimes it would actually provide a teeny bit of material support. But it is, you certainly get, maybe that goes back to the gatekeeping question, sometimes you get caregivers who think that you know, that they're going to get something material out of the research, and so, you know, just be very important, very clear that you are not, that you can't be promising money, you can't be promising to help with school fees for young people, and so on, which can be really difficult and uncomfortable for researchers. I'm sure we could continue that discussion.
Thank you very, very much, Jenny and Simone. It's great to have had you both here to respond to some of the questions. This was obviously a culminate, like I said, this was the culmination of a fantastic year. I'm really pleased to have had you both here today. I'm just going to share my screen very, very quickly to share, you know, again, the PAR YouTube channel, the Brassbar channel, and the Practice as Research website. where you will be able to get access to all of the recordings. And this recording will obviously put up there in due course as well. Again, I would like to say thank you very, very much for joining us today. And I look forward to seeing some of you, all of you, again in the new academic year.